Mangwanani Mwalelepo Vukenjani Klas Vanave Africa. Welcome to Africa Good Morning, the news and current affairs show bringing you everything you need to know happening on the African continent and beyond. You are joined by Diana Master and Ashwin Betty. And of course, next week, Wednesday, yes, Wednesday, the 8th of February, NTV is going to be turning 1 and you can celebrate with us. All you have to do is scan the QR code in the Algamana Zeitung Republican Namibian Sun and you stand a chance to win a DSTV Explorer, a dish kit, a Go TV decoder, as well as a $3,000 Namibian for Shini shopping voucher.
Now let's get into what you can expect in today's broadcast. Deadly cholera outbreak in Malawi, partly blamed on climate change. Nigerian ex-senator accused of organ harvesting appears in the UK court. And finally, Kenya bans night and dawn classes.
Wow, interesting. Yeah. Wow. Stay with us as we head into the top stories. We start with the deadly cholera outbreak in Malawi, which is being partly blamed on climate change. Now, over the past year, more than 1,000 people have died in Malawi of cholera, a disease that is preventable and very easy to treat. The disease is endemic to the East African country, but this outbreak has taken more lives than any in the past, and climate change is at least partly to blame. It began when Malawi, along with Madagascar, Mozambique and Zimbabwe, were hit by a series of cyclones and storms starting in January 2022 that caused floods, deaths and displacement across the region. World Weather Attribution, a group of scientists that assess the role of climate change in extreme weather events, said in April that global warming had made those storms wetter and more intense than they would have otherwise have been, hitting already vulnerable communities harder. That in turn has led to outbreaks of disease that are worse and harder to stem than would otherwise be the case. Now, droughts cause starvation and reduce nutrition, which can cause long-term developmental challenges for children and often outright death. Millions in the Horn of Africa across Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia are suffering from the longest drought in 40 years. Warmer temperatures mean some of these vectors are able to survive and explore newer regions. Climate change also increases the risk of pandemics.
Now getting into our next story, Lebanon devalues official exchange rate by 90%. Lebanon adopted a new official exchange rate of £15,000 per US dollar on Wednesday, the central bank said, marking a 90% devaluation from its previous official rate that had been unchanged for 25 years. The shift from the old rate of 1,507 is still far off the parallel market where most trades take place. Two market participants said the pound was changing hands at around 59,000 per dollar on Tuesday. Now, the pound has crashed since a financial meltdown in 2019 after decades of corruption, profligate spending and mismanagement by the ruling elite in Lebanon, which is hoping to finalize a deal with the International Monetary Fund for a $3 billion bailout. Lebanese officials have described the adoption of the new official exchange rate as a step towards unifying an array of rates that have emerged during the crisis.
Now, Nigerian ex-senator accused of organ harvesting appears in a UK court. Nigeria's former deputy Senate president and his wife appeared in a London court on Tuesday ahead of their trial for organ harvesting, but his accused daughter was unable to attend as she is in hospital. Ike Ekweremadu, 60, appeared at the Old Bailey court on Tuesday morning wearing a grey tracksuit top, speaking only to say yes, miss when asked to confirm his name. He's accused, along with his wife, daughter and a doctor, of bringing a 21-year-old man from Nigeria to have his kidney removed. Prosecutors said the defendants allegedly planned to have a kidney removed from the man so that it could be given to the politician's daughter, Sonia. She was unable to attend court as she is currently in hospital with an unspecified condition, the trial heard. Her defense team have also submitted a psychological report claiming she is not fit to stand trial. The accuser is said to have raised the alarm after refusing to consent to the procedure following preliminary tests in a North London hospital. Charges were brought after the man went to the police in a town outside London, and the Ekweremadus were arrested in June last year at London's Heathrow Airport after flying into the UK.
Now moving over, Pope denounces economic colonialism on a DR Congo visit. Pope Francis arrived in the Democratic Republic of Congo on Tuesday, denouncing economic colonialism that he said had plundered the resources of the mineral-rich and conflict-torn nation. Massive crowds thronged Kinshasa for a glimpse of the Pope cheering and waving flags as the 86-year-old pontiff made his way from the airport to the presidential palace. On his fifth trip to Africa, Pope Francis, 86, is bringing a message of peace to the Democratic Republic of Congo and neighboring South Sudan, both racked by decades of stubborn conflict. In a speech at the presidential palace, the Pope received applause as he touched on the country's history of foreign domination. He said that political exploitation gave way to an economic colonialism that was equally enslaving in the DRC. Despite its vast mineral reserves, the DRC remains one of the poorest countries in the world. About two-thirds of the population lives on less than $2.15 a day, according to the World Bank. It is the first time since 1985 that a pope has visited the DRC, where about 40% of whom are Catholic. The six-day trip to DRC and South Sudan had been planned for July 2022, but postponed due to the pontiff's knee pain that has forced him in recent months to use a wheelchair.
We move over to Kenya as Kenya bans night and dawn classes. Education Minister Ezekiel Machogu has banned early morning and late evening studies in schools, saying we don't want to subject kids to strain. Kids should sleep for 9 hours. Mr. Machogu directed that classes in both private and public primary schools be held between 8 a.m. and 45 minutes past 3 p.m. to ensure learning takes place within the designated times. The syllabus should be covered appropriately between the stipulated time. Let us not subject pupils to unnecessary mental torture, he added. The minister said he had noticed a trend where school buses pick children up as early as 5 a.m. and drop them off as late as 8 a.m. The issue of school reporting times has been contentious in Kenya.
Now let's close off our top stories. Belarus president offers Zimbabwe trucks and tractors on state visit. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko on Tuesday offered Zimbabwe more tractors, combined harvesters and trucks during a visit to the southern African country, a fellow ally of Russia. Belarus and Zimbabwe cooperate closely, especially in agriculture, and Lukashenko said the offer to Harare was part of a farm mechanization program worth around $66 million. The Belarus president, a staunch supporter of Russia, has been received with pomp and fanfare for the 3-day state visit, which started on Monday. Asked whether he was under any obligation to step up support for Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko told a news conference that Belarus would always be ready to offer assistance if needed. Zimbabwe has not condemned Russia for invading Ukraine, calling for dialogue like many other African countries.
That brings us to the end of our top stories on Africa. Good morning. After the break, we're going to be looking at the development of respiratory diseases, particularly in this climate post-COVID-19. Stay with us.
Active Kids is an initiative under the MyZone brand that aims to provide exciting and easy activities and fun stories. If you would like to feature your brand or campaign on this platform, contact zone@synergy.com.na. Active Kids, where we actively invest in your future.
AgriMonitor is jou weeklikse landboukundige program wat jou die jongste nuus in die landbouverwante bedryf en onderwerpe wat daaraan gekoppel is bring. Vir enige advertensie of nuusverwante navraag, kontak agrimonitor@synergy.com.na.
Now, the pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine debate has been going on for quite some time. Now, so let's take a look at how does the vaccine combat the influenza virus? How does the WHO track influenza across the world to decide the composition of the vaccine? Well, Dr. Sylvie Bryant also explains why we are seeing a spike in respiratory diseases in Science in 5. Let's take a look.
We are talking about influenza today. How does the vaccine combat the influenza virus? How is the composition of the vaccine decided? And how does WHO track the influenza virus across the world? Hello and welcome to Science in 5. I'm Vismita Gupta-Smith. We are talking to Dr. Sylvie Briand today. Welcome, Sylvie. Before we talk about influenza, speak to us, please, Sylvie, about this spike in respiratory diseases that we are seeing and the reasons for it.
Indeed, we are seeing a spike in respiratory viruses, all kinds of viruses, COVID-19, influenza, RSV, and this is not a surprise. We always see an increase in respiratory diseases in wintertime for the northern hemisphere. Why? Firstly, because most of the 175 types of circulating respiratory viruses prefer cold and humid weather. Most of them produce mild disease, but some of them, like COVID-19, influenza, or RSV, can produce severe disease, leading to hospitalization and even death. Secondly, when the weather is cold or humid, people tend to gather indoor in less ventilated spaces, and thus are more exposed to infection. However, this year is a bit special. We are seeing more respiratory disease than usual. We think that this increase is due to at least two factors. In the past 3 years, people were applying personal protective measures like masks, washing hands, less gatherings. But this year, in many countries, most of these preventive measures are not applied anymore. In addition, people have probably lost some of their immunity against respiratory viruses in general, given the low circulation of respiratory viruses in the past years, thanks to the protective measure.
Sylvie, talk to us about the influenza virus and how the vaccine combats it.
There are many influenza viruses circulating. We know at least 3 big families, A, H1N1, A, H3N2, and B viruses. What is important to know is that these viruses evolve constantly. As they multiply in human cells, viruses are changing. This is like having a parent virus, making many children, and then having many grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren. The influenza vaccine, it's like a picture of the virus, a picture of the enemy that is shown to our internal defenses, the antibodies. When the antibodies have seen the picture of the virus, they can recognize it. So when the virus enters the body, the antibody can push it out. This is how the influenza vaccine works. However, because of the constant evolution of the virus, we need to update the influenza vaccine composition regularly so that the picture of the enemy that is shown to the antibodies is not the picture of the parent virus that was circulating last year, but the picture of the great-grandchild viruses that are circulating this year.
Sylvie, speak to us about how WHO tracks the influenza virus across the world and how is the composition of the vaccine decided?
The WHO has a network of laboratories around the world called GISRES, the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. This network is composed of more than 150 laboratories in 137 countries. Those laboratories are collecting and monitoring influenza viruses throughout the year. The collected viruses at the national level are then sent regularly to WHO collaborating centers for global assessment. Experts meet regularly to monitor the circulating virus, assess which ones are predominant, and then define which ones should be considered for the vaccine so that the picture of the enemy is the best possible picture to train our antibodies to fight the virus. This represents an enormous amount of work, but many countries in the world are participating in this effort because influenza is an important public health issue and is killing between 200 to 600,000 people every year, which represent nearly 8,000 deaths per week on average. So the influenza vaccine is safe and very effective to protect against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And it is strongly recommended for people at risk of severe disease, such as elderly, people with underlying condition and comorbidities like immunosuppression, diabetes, chronic respiratory and cardiac diseases, and so on. Influenza vaccine is also recommended for pregnant women and young children. We also encourage healthcare workers to get vaccinated, as they are more exposed to the virus in their professional practice, and they are less likely to infect their patients when vaccinated.
Thank you, Sylvie. That was Science in 5 today. Until next time then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stick with science.
You are still with Africa. Good morning. Let's have a look at the weather predictions. Heading into economic news, according to industry data, gold demand is at its highest in over a decade. Gold demand struck its highest level since 2011 last year, boosted by soaring purchases from central banks and other investors seeking shelter from rocketing inflation, industry data showed on Tuesday. Demand for precious metal, traditionally a haven investment in times of economic and geopolitical turmoil, rocketed almost a fifth to 4,740.7 tons in 2022 from the prior year, the World Gold Council said. Purchases from central banks more than doubled to reach 1,136 tons, the highest total for more than 5 decades, as Ukraine's war fueled inflation. Gold is very much a long-term show of value, and fact is it performs well in a time of crisis, said WGC analyst Louise Street. Gold demand faces mixed prospects in 2023, but with upside potential, the WGC added. Investment will likely be supported by elevated recession and geopolitical risks, and jewelry demand should benefit from continued recovery in China.
Now, Nigeria's lower house approves extra 2.2 billion central bank loans to government. Nigeria's lower house of parliament has approved President Muhammadu Buhari's request to borrow an extra $2.2 billion in temporary advances from the country's central bank to help plug gaps in last year's budget, lawmakers said on Tuesday. Buhari asked Parliament in December for approval to borrow an extra 1 trillion naira in so-called ways and means advances from the central bank, taking the government's total borrowing to 23.7 trillion naira, which is $52 billion. The president also requested approvals to convert the temporary advance into 40-year bonds at 9% interest to cut interest payments, but lawmakers questioned the plan. The lawmakers said on Tuesday that they would discuss with officials on the plan to turn the central bank borrowings to government into long-term debt. Lawmakers at the upper house of parliament, who are currently on recess to campaign for elections during March, will need to approve the borrowing plan for it to become law.
That brings us to the end of our economic news stories. After the break, we head into the sports.
In Business 7, you get news on current economic, financial, and business matters in Namibia. The weekly show features interviews with experts and in-depth analysis of burning issues in a way that caters for ordinary Namibians and business connoisseurs alike. For news-related or advertising queries, please contact B7 at synergy.com.na.
Now, for every sports lover, there's a heartbreaking moment which you in turn appreciate because it actually signifies a beautiful journey when you have to let go of the greatest of all time. When Muhammad Ali put his gloves down, when Jonah Lomu sat on the sidelines, when Tiger Woods is still playing, but you know. When Pele took his last shot, and yesterday it was time for American football to let go of the great Tom Brady. 23-year career, someone who was not drafted anywhere near the top 100 drafts, but ended up having 7 championships and arguably, in fact, undisputedly, the greatest of all time in that sport. And he will be joining Fox News as a commentator on American football. Now we swing over to something a little more familiar to Africa, cricket. But we're not talking African cricket, we're talking about England's Sam Curran, who was fined for excessive celebration of Themba Bavuma dismissal. England bowler Sam Curran has been fined 15% of his match fee and given 1 demerit point for his reaction to dismissing South Africa's Themba Bavuma. Bavuma was bowled for 109 when he tried a ramp shot of Curran in South Africa's win in the second ODI. The International Cricket Council said Curran excessively celebrated towards and in close proximity of the opener. It added it was an action which had the potential to provoke an aggressive reaction from Bavuma. Curran admitted the level 1 offence of the ICC's Code of Conduct, and so a formal hearing was not needed. It is Curran's first demerit point, and the accumulation of 4 in a 24-month period would result in a ban. The innings by Bavuma, who is South Africa's white ball captain, helped his side to actually win the match and take an unassailable 2-0 lead in the 3-match series.
Now, Ukraine is on a mission to ban Russia from Olympics. IOC says sanctions stand. Ukraine hopes to secure widespread international support for banning Russian and Belarusian athletes from the Paris Olympics in 2024 due to Moscow's invasion, the sports minister said on Tuesday. Vadim Hutsaid, 51, a former Olympic fencing champion, told Reuters the idea of allowing Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete as neutrals was unacceptable. It is impossible for us at a time when the full-scale war is going on, when our athletes, our soldiers are defending our homeland, he said in his Kyiv office beside a wall with portraits of athletes killed in the war. Now, last week, the International Olympic Committee said it was open to including Russian and Belarusian athletes as neutrals at the game and opened the door to them competing in qualifiers, prompting an international campaign by Kyiv to keep them out. Moscow said on Tuesday it would welcome any IOC moves to allow its athletes to compete in the Olympics.
Now we swing over to Newcastle as they've booked their place in the first major final in 24 years after overcoming Southampton 2-1 at home on Tuesday in their League Cup semi-final second leg to seal a 3-1 victory on aggregate. Newcastle had won the first leg 1-0 away last week. Now it was the midfielder's first score at St. James Park in almost 4 years. This is Sean Longstaff, and he struck again in the 21st minute, knocking in a cutback from Miguel Almiron to finish off a flowing team move sparked by a slalom run by forward Joe Willock. Newcastle midfielder Bruno Guimaraes was shown a straight red card in the 82nd minute after a VAR review for a studs-up tackle on Samuel Edozie, but Eddie Howe's side survived, playing in the final stretch of the match with 10 men. They will be building for their first win trophy since the 1955 FA Cup.
Now bringing us to the end of our sports stories, world champions face All Blacks twice before title defense. The Springboks fixture list for the 2023 season was finalized by SA Rugby on Wednesday. The Boks will face arch rivals New Zealand twice away in the Rugby Championship and in a World Cup warm-up match in London. SA Rugby also confirmed the Boks home venues in a shortened Rugby Championship. The world champions will kick off their season against Australia on 8 July at Loftus Versfeld in Pretoria.
Certainly wishing the Springboks the best. You're still with Africa. Good morning. Your highlights after the break.
Ironga Talk brings you community news in the Orongo region. For news-related or advertising queries, contact irongotalk at synergy.com.na. Ironga Talk, our community, your news.
You're watching Africa Good Morning, and now it's time for us to sign off. But before we do that, let's take a look at the highlights from today's broadcast. Deadly cholera outbreak in Malawi partly blamed on climate change. Lebanon devalues official exchange rate by 90%. Nigerian ex-senator accused of organ harvesting appears in a UK court. Gold demand highest in over a decade, and this is according to industry data.
Those have been our stories. See you tomorrow. Suraj Vaganaka.